Thank you, Elsie. Good morning. Welcome along. As Elsie already talked about, we've come to the end of our series on Hebrews about never giving up. And it's nice to have quite a good example of never giving up, isn't it? 14 years of fostering, that's about never giving up, isn't it? That's about sticking with something for the long term. So this week's theme, this week's idea, we're talking about faith in action, faith and what it means. And the verses in Hebrews go through that for us. And I don't know what you think about when you hear the word faith. I don't know what you think about when you hear that word. Do you think about times when you put your faith in someone? Do you make you think about times when you had faith in an institution? Don't we? There's been lots of times over the recent years where people have talked about they've lost faith in big institutions. And I could list them off, but we probably know the ones that have shown up in the news, didn't we? Maybe we think about the downsides of faith. Maybe we think about the good sides as well. We put our faith in someone and they came through. Someone was there for us when we needed it the most. A few years ago, I went on a youth group weekend away. Actually, it was with some of the youth group here, though it's so long ago that those people are now grown up and have their own kids, maybe even out the back. It's gone that far and come around again. But it was the youth group weekend away, and we went to one of these outdoor activity places where you can do, abseiling, canoeing, that sort of thing. And I can tell by maybe some people's faces that some people that's their, they don't mind that weekend away. Some people that's their worst idea. That's not in any way, shape or form how you want to be spending your weekend. But while we were there, they got us to do some team building activities, and they were trying to get us to trust each other maybe, or put our faith in each other. And one of the activities we had to do was an assault course. And it was a fairly simple assault course. It's only a few feet or so off the ground. You're walking along things, you're balancing, you're having to climb over things. You weren't going to get too hurt if you fell off, but it wouldn't be great. But what made it a bit trickier was that they put blindfolds on some of us and paired us up. So we're in pairs. One person is blindfolded, one person is not. And the job is to guide each other, I suppose, but mostly the person who can see what's going on. Their job is to guide the other person through, take them by the hand, shout at them, whatever is needed to get them through that assault course. And we did this, and it was good fun. Maybe at the time I wasn't quite sure, especially as I was the one who got to be blindfolded. But the interesting bit for me when I did it is that the person I was partnering with was then and still is my wife. And so I don't know if I'd recommend that as a way to build your early time of marriage. Maybe it should be done before, it should be part of the pre-marriage prep. If you can get through this without falling out with each other, without causing a big argument, you're all set for marriage. It's a long time ago. I'm not going to take sides. My wife's not here to defend herself. But anyway, we got through it. We didn't have a big argument. But it sticks in my mind as a time of faith, putting your faith in someone in quite a vivid way, where you literally can't see where you're going. Sometimes the word faith is maybe a bit abstract. Sometimes we struggle to describe the word faith without using the word faith. It's a bit circular like that. Maybe this gives us a better idea. I think there's a sense, so if you can remember back to your birthdays as a child, for me that's quite a long time ago. I've got much more chance remembering my own kids' birthdays, but the way it generally goes as a child, in the weeks, even months leading up to your birthday, you have this real sense of assurance. You're really putting your faith and trust in your parents that they are going to get you a birthday present, whatever that might be. You have that assurance, hopefully for most people, that you had that assurance growing up that you're going to get a present from your parents. There's also a sense of anticipation, isn't there? You don't know what it is. And I know in our house that anticipation can cause, that's the fun part, right? The parents want to buy a surprise for their kids. The kids want to know what the present is. They don't necessarily want to wait till the day of their birthday, and so on. So maybe a good way to think about our faith is assurance and anticipation. And this lines up a bit with what we see in Hebrews 11, verse 1. If you ever need a definition of faith, just remember Hebrews 11, verse 1, as read to us earlier on. In the NIV it says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, an assurance about what we do not see." And the version that Elsie got us to all read this morning says, "Faith means being sure of the things we hope for and knowing that something is real even if we do not see it. So there's this idea of assurance, knowing something's going to work out. Confidence, hope is another word that is often used along with faith. N.T. Wright, who writes a lot of books about the Bible, said this: faith is looking at God and trusting in him for everything. Hope is looking at the future and trusting God for it. Those two things, looking at God and trusting him, is what our faith is about. And we have a hope we can look to God and trust him for the future. And that's what's so significant about our faith, isn't it? It's around God. It starts with, in fact, God's character. And it will end ultimately with God's promises being fulfilled. Maybe in our lifetime, maybe further down the line. It starts and ends with God. Whatever we think about faith in human terms, faith in God is something different. It starts with God's character. He is who he says he is. And it ends with God's promises. And we see that during our lives as well. He will do what he says. These verses this morning come from the beginning of Hebrews 11 and the beginning of Hebrews 12. And if you know anything about Hebrews, you probably know the bit in the middle, which is the long list, sometimes called the heroes of faith. It's a list of all these characters, great people, men and women from the Old Testament, who lived lives of faith. And we're called to do the same thing. We can have a faith, we can have hope. We can have assurance, we can have anticipation, looking forward to God's promises being fulfilled. But we can only do all this because it starts and ends with God. God's character, if we read through our Bibles, maybe some of us can attest to this in our lives, in the lives of others. We can see times, we know of times where God's character's come through. We've been able to depend on the character of God and what he's done in our lives. But maybe also for people here, we're looking forward to God fulfilling promises in our lives. The ultimate promise of heaven, but promises along the way. Just going to look quickly at some of the people in this section, just to give a recap, unless you don't already know it. So this is from Hebrews 11, 4-40, and we could probably do an entire series on just these people here, listed going through each one of their lives. And we're not going to do that this morning, but I just want to give us an encouragement to one of the ways that we can live a life of faith is look at how others have lived their lives of faith. It doesn't just have to be people from the Old Testament. It can be the people sat here amongst us. It can be contemporary Christians. There's many books about Christians living at the moment in different ways, in different lives, where they talk about their life of faith. I encourage us to learn to look at other people's lives of faith. But as a bit of a homework challenge maybe for this week, this list of the great heroes of faith, there's some of them listed there. Abraham, who obeyed God's call. Sarah, who remained faithful even though she wasn't able to have children. Moses put his trust in God in a really big way and stood up to the Egyptians and was part of helping the Israelites flee from them. And Rahab, who took a big risk, was in a town that was hostile to the Israelites but saw something in the spies who came to her and protected them and took the risk in that way. So the kind of homework challenge maybe, if you want to look at it this week, is to go through these verses from Hebrews, the end of Hebrews 11, and look at some of these stories. Look at them anew. Maybe for some of us, the last time we saw these stories, it was out the back in Sunday Club when one of the leaders dressed up as Moses or whatever they might have done to teach that to us. Look at these stories, see how they might relate to our lives. Even though there are people who lived thousands of years ago, there's things that we can get from them. One bit that I only really recently understood about Moses, and I should have really twigged a bit earlier, but you see Moses and you think of the big stories, the big events in his life, but actually there's quite long periods of time where Moses was living ordinary life. It talks about maybe even 40 years in between some of the bigger things that we read, where he was looking after his family, doing his job, tending the sheep, whatever he would have been doing that time, living a regular day in, day out life of faith. Obviously, God was using those times to prepare him for the big events. That's part of it. But we see really that he grew in faith in those times. And the Moses that we read about at the beginning is different than the Moses that God used later on. So even someone like Moses, we think, I'm not going to be in a situation to free an entire race of people from slavery. That's not going to be in my lifetime. But we can think about what Moses did in the rest of his lifetime and be encouraged by that. But now moving on to the last verses that we read earlier on from Hebrews 12. If we're going to think about faith and our journey of faith, as it quite vividly describes it in those verses as a race, we maybe have to ask ourselves from time to time, how is our faith going? It's a very personal thing. It's something that we should be involved in. If we consider ourselves Christians, then our faith is important. In fact, when we were praying this morning, Gillian said, out of all the things, our faith is the most important thing. And that suddenly made me think, yes, that is absolutely true. Our faith is absolutely front and centre of our lives if we want to live as Christians. Do we think about where our faith's at? Do we look back compared to a year ago and see if there's any different in the faith in our lives? Good or bad, it's fine to look at it either way and be honest about it. Do we encourage other people here in church in their faith? Do people encourage us? Maybe a good question to ask yourselves if you're a Christian is, what was the last time you had a conversation with someone else about faith, their faith, your faith, successes, failures, being open and honest about it? Because what we see pretty clearly in Hebrews 12, 1-3, is it gives us this really useful picture of running with perseverance the race marked out for us. Maybe we need to ask how the race is going. There's 4 bits I want to end on before we go into a time of communion to make us think about this. There's 4 things that struck me from those verses in Hebrews 12. And they look a little bit like this. One part is, we're definitely not called to be spectators in this. There's a sense in these verses of the crowd of people cheering on, but they're the ones who've run the race. They've done their race. They're been and gone. There's a real sense in this that we're not meant to be just sat in the nice comfy seats watching the event, however we might think about it. We're meant to be part of this race. All our races look different. All our paths through lives look different. Our faith is at different places, but we're all meant to engage in this in some way. Another bit that comes through in the verses is actually the idea of carrying too much baggage. I don't know why this guy is carrying this huge amount of cardboard. I'm sure he's got a good reason. It's all nicely tied up if you can't quite make it out in the picture. Maybe he's selling it, maybe he's recycling it, whatever it might be. But I wouldn't recommend running a race, pulling that on. That's going to make things harder than it needs to be. These verses are pretty clear in saying off that we need to throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Maybe if we're honest with ourselves about where our faith is at and things aren't going as well as we'd like, maybe the answer is in this part here. Throwing off things that get in the way, sin that easily entangles. Sometimes life can get on top of other things. We all have different things going on in our lives. I'm not saying that we can all devote every part of our lives, but we're called as Christians to walk daily with God. When we look at people we know who we think are strong in faith, a large part of what they do is the daily walk with God, taking time out of their day, putting that ahead of other things in their life. But we can also remember that God sent us the Holy Spirit. If it's particularly about sin that is making a struggle for us in our race and we're finding it harder to run than we need to be if we want to continue the analogy, God sent us, Jesus left us the Holy Spirit to do that. We don't have to struggle through this alone. The other part that comes out about this idea of a race is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. It's unlikely to be over in the, we're not all going to run 100 metres in 10 seconds, maybe 30, 40, 50 seconds. It's not a 100-metre race. The Christian life is throughout our life, in for the long haul, day in, day out. And I'm sure some of us know people, again, we consider faithful Christians who live in this way, day in, day out, over many years, faithfully serving in their church, faithfully encouraging other people, faithfully praying for others. Again, the story of Moses always strikes me, as I shared before. Moses had maybe 40 years of living a more ordinary life before these extraordinary events happened. I'm sure he had many challenges along the way. We don't really read too much about that part of his life, but there's a sense that he grew in his faith. He was still walking in his faith with God in that time as much as in the other parts of his life. And the other part in these verses is about fixing our eyes on Jesus. In fact, it says that the way that we can persevere with this, what we need to do. These verses are clear that we need to fix our eyes on Jesus. Not fixing our eyes on the prize, as we might say in other situations, but fixing our eyes on Jesus. As it is Mother's Day, I did just want to acknowledge all the mothers, grandmothers, aunties, sisters, and all the other combinations you can come up with around that. Because actually we see that in the lives of many mothers, don't we? Many grandmothers. They're running the race of perseverance. Parenthood, motherhood, has many of the same characteristics as these images. In it for the long haul. So whilst we're here talking specifically about our lives of faith, I want to acknowledge that bringing up children, being involved in the lives of children is definitely a marathon, not a sprint. So well done to all the women, all the mothers. Thank you for what each and every one of you have done in your role for all the children that we know here in our church and wider. So to recap the four things then, we're thinking about that we're not just spectators. If we want to think about our faith as this idea of a race, these very vivid example in Hebrews 12, we don't just get to be spectators watching others run the race. Maybe we need to think about if we're carrying too much baggage, what's slowing us down, what's getting in the way. It's definitely a marathon, not a sprint. It's something we have to commit to day in, day out. But ultimately, the way we get through it, the way we persevere through the race, the way we can be successful in that is that we look to Jesus. We keep our eyes fixed on him. So to finish, before we go into a time of communion and have a real vivid example of how we can keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, how we can have a time of thinking about Jesus. On these verses again, let us look only to Jesus, the one who began our faith and who makes it perfect. Jesus gives an example of how we can run the race well. Jesus, if we want to keep with the analogy, he's there at the finish line waiting for us, but he ran the race. He went through tough times. He experienced opposition. He had times when he was shamed by others. He went through many of the things that we can go through. So one way we can persevere with this is look to how Jesus did things. But ultimately, we can raise our eyes to him at the finishing line. One of the books I read this week had a nice line that said it like this: keep our eyes, or our imagination if we're too far away, fixed on the finishing line, and Jesus who is there in the centre. We should be running for Christ, not for ourselves, so that, as it says in Hebrews 12:3, we will not grow weary and lose heart. I pray that in the days and weeks ahead we can continue to run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. Amen.